Welcome back to the shop, my friends. Steve here, and in today's video I'm painting up one of my favorite miniatures from the Trench Crusade lineup, the Sin Eater. Now, even though I don't run the Black Grail or the Heretic, so I can't use this guy as a mercenary for my warbands, I had to paint him up, and that's because I'm a huge Berserk fan, and if you know, you know. So, I want to show you the steps that I took to paint up the Sin Eater. Let's go ahead and get started. The mini was first printed on my Elegoo Saturn 4 and then dusted with some self-etching primer. The base color for his armor is going to be Monument Hobbies Pro Acryl Dark Silver. For a metallic, this paint covers really well and is brushed onto all the armor covering his body as well as his chainmail. For coverage, I wouldn't really recommend to add any water to these metallics because it could displace the pigments a bit too much and you might have to do a second coat. For his cloak, I'm going to start with some Vallejo brand German Gray. Vallejo paints also cover really well, and they give a nice smooth matte finish. Because of its opacity, I start by using a number 2 brush from Redgrass Games. This will allow me to get the pigment right up next to the armor before I switch to a larger brush. And at this point, I'm not worried about covering any of the skulls or the body because they're going to get their own paint treatment later on. And I know it's one of the simple things in life, but I like having a nice, smooth, glossy base. A little bit of painter's tape helps me from having to paint them black in the end. I'd like to have some gold variations to this armor, even though a lot of it's going to be covered up by rust and silver later on. So to start this process, I'm going to be using Army Painter's Speed Paint Nuclear Sunrise. Because I am applying this as more of a watered down wash than its true intentions, I did go back and apply a second pass to some of the larger areas to break up the surface. After that had dried, I switched over to some watered down Zealot Yellow. Just like the Sunrise, this is applied more as a highlight wash than a true speed paint application. And I think that's because 20 years ago when I was painting, we didn't have speed paints, we just did a bunch of different types of washes and glazes. So I haven't really gotten totally comfortable yet with the whole speed paint technique. But in this application, they work great to simply tint and not change the entire hue and saturation. At this point, with just 3 colors added, I'm getting some really cool variations in the armor. Next up, I'm going to do another wash, but this time to the cloak, using Army Painter's Speed Paint, Grim Black, and Absolution Green. These are going to be mixed together 1-to-1, but I'm still watering them down. I'm applying this with a fairly large brush, just to make sure that I have enough of the pigments added to the cloak. But I am being very careful not to get it on the armor, because I'm afraid that it would darken those areas just way too much. Here's where I love how the color theory comes into play. The shadows in the recesses of this cloak have that little bit of green hint, which plays really well with the browns and the yellows that are already on the armor. It's time to break out some Dirty Down rust, and before I apply this liquid to the model, I did lightly heat up the miniature using my hairdryer. This is going to help the chemical reaction that the Dirty Down has, and it seems to have a lot more color variation to it if the liquid and the model are at a warmer temperature. The Dirty Down is applied across the model, especially in areas where water would collect, but because that armor has that nice golden tone underneath, I don't have to cover the entire model. I did also add the Dirty Down to the weapon, but I watered it down quite a bit so it would have a different look compared to the armor. With all the shadows, textures, and base colors added to the armor, I can now go in and highlight using more of that Pro Acryl Dark Silver. This time around though, it's going to be a lot more of a dry brush technique. I definitely do not want to cover up all of the washes and the rust that I had previously applied to the armor. Now when applying this technique, make sure that your brush has a little bit of moisture actually in it. It's not a true dry brush. This is going to make sure that the paint isn't chalky and it will flow a little bit better out of the bristles. It will also make sure that you don't get this annoying texture that you can sometimes get from dry brushing. I'm also making sure to apply this paint specifically to highlight areas. If my light source is directly above, that's what I want to focus on. For his hammer, I changed up my brush technique. I went more with a stipple versus side-to-side brush strokes. That way, even though I'm using the same color, it offsets just enough to be visually different. After these layers are dried, I could then go in with a liner brush and do some edge highlighting. This is going in and picking out the most concentrated highlights, specifically picking out the edges of the armor where the rust would have been scraped away throughout battle. And one thing that helps me, of course now that I'm getting older, is to use the edge of the brush rather than the point. Just make sure that your paintbrush has enough pigment built up into the bristles so that it flows out smooth. I then switch it up and I use just the point of the liner brush. This makes it look like the armor has fresh scratches, especially on the chest, shoulder pads, and anywhere else that would receive a little more damage. Using my round dry brush, I can now start to highlight the cape. And since I added that wash to darken it down, I can now go in with more of that German gray, and that will be my first highlight. Because I would like this cape to have a little more texture, I'm also going to use the stippling technique here as well. And look at my little baby dry brush, just for the tiny areas. The cape is looking good, but before I do a final pass, I would like to go ahead and paint the skulls, his teeth, and the body on the back. That way, in case I make a mistake and have to clean something up, I would rather do it now than on my final layer. To paint the bones and his teeth, I'm going to be using, surprise, Vallejo brand Bone White. Now I found with this paint, even though it's part of the game series, that it seems to be a little thin, so I do plan on adding this in 2 coats. While my first layer of Bone White dries, I'm going to be using some Vallejo brand Brown Rose to paint this guy's guts, that are apparently splayed all over the back of the Sin Eater. Now I know what you're thinking is right now these colors look way too light for a base color, but I'm going to be adding some washes that will darken them down. I can now go back and add a second layer of the Bone White, and this process still works great because this layer definitely looks like more of an intentional highlight. My first wash layer for the skulls and the body on the back is going to be a custom mixture of Army Painter's Strong Tone and Citadel's Lamia Medium. This wash is going to be liberally applied to all of these areas. After that's dried for about 20 minutes, I then go in with a second wash. This is a custom mixture of Army Painter's Dark Tone and Citadel's Lamia Medium. This will be applied more specifically to recessed areas, the eyes and mouths on the skulls, and then the guts and the shadowed areas around the body on the back. And I did throw a little bit into the cape recesses as well. So as my final highlight on the cape, I mixed together some of that Bone White and the German Gray. I'm a little more selective this time around, stippling just the highest points of the cape. Even though a lot of this will be covered up by the blood effects, I did go in with some Vallejo brand Saddle Brown and pick out the ropes on the skulls and the body. I'm not really worried about these looking absolutely perfect, but if some of the blood effects don't hit the ropes, I don't want them to be the same color as the skulls. I'm going to apply the blood effects in a 2-part process. Part 1 is going to be sketching out placement with a liner brush using some speed paint Slaughter Red. Because this paint is thinner, it's easier for me to sketch out exactly where I'd like the blood to go. And to match the concept art, I'm going to apply a good amount of Slaughter Red around the mouth and down the front of the chest, so much that it drips down onto the skulls underneath. I also noticed there was a considerable amount of blood on the spikes on his hands as well as his hammer. When I get to the back, I would like for blood to come out of the middle of the carcass as well as the neck and the hands. And of course it has to look as though it has dripped down onto the lower section of his cape. With my blood areas sketched, I can now switch over to some Perma Blood. This liquid is a much thicker application that I normally use in my props and costumes, but I love its overall consistency because it stays thick, and more importantly, it keeps this glossy shine. Now when working with it, it does dry fast, so I would recommend to work in multiple layers. Go through your model, add it to all the areas that you want, and then you can always come back and add more on top. This is going to help give you that overall thicker, coagulated look. Now notice on the front I put it around the mouth but not on his teeth. I want those to stand out. When I get to the back, I can follow those same blood sketches that I had put down earlier. Now notice here I add a lot in the midsection and at the neck, but his guts that are trailing off to the sides, I don't add a lot of blood there because I want that pink to be vibrant and to show through. And of course I add some blood to the bottom of his cape, but not a lot. I want it to look as though the cloth has soaked this up, so it wouldn't be near as thick or vibrant. To keep a consistency between all my Trench Crusade factions, I'm once again going to be using a mixture of Mars Black and Burnt Umber as my base mud. I use more of the Vallejo Bone White to paint the skulls on the base as well. Plus another application of the Strong Tone wash can be applied. While the wash dries, I paint the barbed wire with some iridescent rich silver. And then some Dirty Down rust because it can't look too new for this battlefield. The wash is dried, so I can go in and do some final highlights on the skulls. Deco Art Gloss Varnish is going to be applied to some parts of the base. This will give the mud a nice, rich, wet look. And with that, our Sin Eater is complete and he is ready to stomp some pilgrims.